welcome to another slow descent into sleep. Tonight's story begins with a breath, the very last breath, caught before it can vanish into the dark. It is kept here in a monastery of stone and shadow, where candlelight trembles across centuries-old walls, and silent hands guard what the world forgets. These are the breath takers, keepers of final exhalations, cradling them in velvet and glass, as if holding a soul before it slips away. Let your eyes grow heavy, let the hum of the night carry you, and if these quiet wanderings bring you comfort, you might consider subscribing, or telling us where and when you're listening from. Now, rest easy and follow the breath takers into sleep. 1349. The breath takers begin their watch. The bell rings twice. Shadows gather in the southern wing. The limestone walls of San Giorgio Maggiore held the coolness of centuries within their pale grey surfaces. And in the spring of 1349, they held something more. The weight of silence that comes when prayers are whispered, rather than sung, when footsteps are softened by necessity rather than reverence. The monastery had been transformed, as so many sacred places had been transformed in those days when death moved through the Italian peninsula like a slow tide, claiming villages and cities with the same unhurried certainty that spring claimed the hillsides. She moved through these corridors as she had moved through them for 3 months now, her bare feet making no sound against the worn stone floors that had been polished smooth by the passage of countless monks over the decades before the pestilence came. Her feet were pale and narrow, and they had grown accustomed to the particular chill that rose from the limestone, a cold that seemed to seep upward through her bones, band, settle in her chest, where it mingled with the other coldness that had taken residence there. The coldness of her work, the coldness of watching, the coldness of waiting for the moment when breath would cease and her purpose would be fulfilled. The light that filtered through the high windows of the southern wing fell in long rectangles across the floor, and dust motes danced within those. Pale golden bars with a languorous grace that reminded her of how souls might move when they were no longer bound to the weight of flesh. The light was softer now than it had been in the early days of her service here, filtered as it was through the smoke of countless tallow candles and the herbs that the apothecary woman burned in small clay vessels throughout the halls. Rosemary and sage and thyme, their fragrance meant to ward off the miasma that was believed to carry the pestilence from room to room, from breath to breath. In the first room of the southern wing, a nobleman lay upon a wooden cot that had been covered with linen sheets, bleached white and pressed smooth by the sisters, who had once tended to the spiritual needs of this place and now tended to the needs of the dying. His name was written in the great ledger that the head sister kept, written in the careful script that had once recorded baptisms and marriages and the dates when novices took their vows. Now it recorded only arrivals and departures of a different sort, each entry marked with red ink that seemed to glow like small embers against the cream-colored pages. The nobleman's breathing was shallow and labored, each inhalation requiring a visible effort that drew his ribs upward beneath the rough woolen blanket that covered him to his chin. His face was grey with the particular pallor that comes not from fear but from the body's slow retreat from its outermost territories, the gradual withdrawal of life's warmth from the extremities toward the core, where it made its final stand in the chambers of the heart and the corridors of the lungs. She had been watching him for 2 days now, sitting in the wooden chair that had been placed beside his bed, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing synchronized to his own, so that she might know the precise moment when his rhythm began to falter and fail. This was her gift, this ability to match her breath to another's, to feel in her own chest the subtle changes that preceded the final departure. It was why she had been chosen for this work, why she had been brought to this place when the pestilence first reached the shores of the Venetian lagoon and began its slow, inexorable spread across the mainland. The velvet cloth that she would use to capture his final breath lay folded beside her on a small wooden table, its deep blue surface soft as night and dense as prayer. It had been blessed by the head sister, sprinkled with holy water, and touched to the relics that were kept in the chapel's silver reliquary. Though whether these rituals held any power beyond the comfort they provided to those who performed them was a question that occupied the minds of theologians and philosophers, not the minds of those who did the work of collecting the breath of the dying. Through the window beside the nobleman's bed, she could see the garden that the monks had once tended with such care, where rows of vegetables and herbs had grown in neat lines between paths of crushed oyster shells. Now the garden had returned to wildness, though a gentler wildness than might be expected. The plants grew as they chose, but they grew without the violence of weeds or the chaos of abandonment. The lettuce had gone to seed and scattered itself in pleasing patterns among the stones, and the rosemary had spread beyond its original borders to form small, grey-green colonies that released their fragrance when the wind moved through them. The wind was gentle today, carrying with it the scent of the lagoon and the salt marshes beyond, where the waters moved in their eternal rhythm between the mainland and the sea. It carried also the sound of bells from the city across the water, where life continued in its altered form, where merchants still sold their wares in the markets and fishermen still cast their nets in the channels, though fewer in number than in the days before the pestilence, and more careful in their interactions, more conscious of the invisible threads that might connect one person's breath to another's fate. In the second bed of this room lay a woman whose age was difficult to determine, for the pestilence had a way of aging faces that made decades collapse into days, adding lines and hollows where none had existed before. She had been a baker, according to the notation in the head sister's ledger, and her hands bore the permanent dusting of flour that no amount of washing could completely remove from the creases of her palms and the beds of her fingernails. These hands lay motionless now upon the wool blanket, and her breathing was so soft that it barely stirred the cloth that covered her chest. The baker had arrived 3 days after the nobleman, carried in by her son and daughter-in-law, who had wept as they placed her upon the bed and arranged her hair with the careful tenderness of those who know they are performing a final act of love. They had brought with them a small loaf of bread that she had baked in the last days of her health, its crust golden brown and its interior still soft despite the time that had passed since its making. This bread now sat upon the table beside her bed, untouched but present, a testament to the skill that had defined her life, and would soon become only a memory, preserved in the red ink of the head sister's careful records. The third bed in this room was occupied by a child, a boy whose age could not have been more than 7 or 8 years, with hair the color of wheat and eyes that had grown large in his thinned face. He had been brought by his grandfather, an old man who had carried the boy in his arms and whispered prayers in a dialect that none of the sisters could understand, though the meaning was clear enough in the way his voice broke on certain words, and the way his hands trembled as he smoothed the child's hair away from his fevered brow. The boy still possessed a spark of curiosity that the pestilence had not yet extinguished, and he would sometimes turn his head to watch her as she sat in her chair, his eyes following the gentle movement of her breathing, the slow rise and fall of her chest beneath the grey woolen robe that marked her as one of the breath-takers. He did not speak, whether from weakness or from some understanding that words were not necessary in this place. But sometimes his lips would move in what might have been a prayer, or might have been the recitation of some childhood verse remembered from healthier days. The light in the room began to change as the sun moved toward the western horizon, and the rectangles of golden illumination shifted across the floor, their edges growing softer and their color deepening to the warm amber of aged honey. This was the time when the young monk would begin his evening rounds, moving from room to room with his armload of tallow candles, and his voice soft with the words of scripture that he read aloud to comfort the dying, and to fill the silence with something other than the sound of labored breathing. She could hear his footsteps now in the corridor outside, the soft whisper of rope sandals against stone, accompanied by the faint creak of the wooden board he carried, upon which were arranged the candles and the small clay lamp filled with oil, pressed from olives that had grown in groves far from the reach of pestilence. His voice drifted through the doorway as he stopped in the room across the hall, reading from the Gospel of John in Latin that flowed like water over stones, each syllable shaped with the careful precision of one who understood that words spoken to the dying must be offered with particular reverence. The nobleman's breathing changed then, becoming shallower still, and she felt the corresponding shift in her own chest, the way her lungs seemed to echo the struggle that was taking place in his. This was the moment she had been waiting for, though waiting was perhaps not the correct word. She had been present for it, ready for it, open to it in the way that a vessel is open to water or a window is open to light. She reached for the velvet cloth and unfolded it carefully, her movements deliberate and unhurried, for haste had no place in this work. The head sister appeared in the doorway then, as she always did when the time of departure drew near. Her face was lined with weariness and marked by the particular sorrow of one who has recorded too many names in red ink. But her presence brought a sense of order to the room, a reminder that this work, though touched by mystery, was also touched by grace. She carried with her the great ledger and the quill pen and the small pot of ink that gleamed like garnets in the candlelight, ready to mark the precise moment when another soul would be released from the burden of flesh. The apothecary woman followed close behind, her hands protected by leather gloves that had been soaked in vinegar and dried in the sun, her face partially concealed by a cloth mask that had been perfumed with oils of lavender and mint. She moved to the nobleman's bedside and placed her gloved fingers against his throat, feeling for the pulse that would tell her how much time remained. Though such measurements had grown less precise as the weeks passed and the signs became more subtle, more dependent upon intuition than upon the evidence of the senses. The young monk entered the room as well, his candles casting dancing shadows upon the walls as he took his position near the foot of the nobleman's bed. He did not speak, for he understood that this was not a time for words, but for presence, for bearing witness to the mystery of departure that could not be explained, or hurried, or altered by human intervention. His lips moved in silent prayer, and the light from his candles joined with the fading light from the window to create a warm glow that seemed to soften the hard edges of mortality. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the gathering shadows, stood the two other breath-takers, the older woman who had taught her this work, and the younger girl who was still learning its rhythms and requirements. They waited in perfect stillness, their own breathing so quiet as to be nearly imperceptible, their presence felt rather than seen, like guardian spirits whose purpose was not to intervene, but simply to witness and remember. The nobleman's eyes opened then, though they did not focus on anything in the room, but seemed to be looking toward something beyond the walls, beyond the window, beyond the immediate world of stone and flesh and candlelight. His lips parted slightly, and she held the velvet cloth ready, positioned just above his mouth but not touching, waiting for the moment when his final breath would pass into the soft blue fibers and be held there like a prayer made tangible. The silence in the room deepened until it seemed to have weight and substance, until it pressed against the walls and rose toward the ceiling like incense. Even the sounds from the other rooms, the soft coughing, the rustle of linen, the creak of wooden bed frames, seemed to fade into insignificance, as though the entire monastery had paused to acknowledge what was about to occur within these limestone walls. His chest rose one final time, a slow and deliberate lifting that seemed to gather all the strength that remained in his body. And then it fell with a sigh that was barely audible, but unmistakable in its finality. She moved the cloth forward in that precise moment, allowing the last whisper of air to be caught in its soft embrace, and then she held it there for several heartbeats, while the silence settled around them like snow. The head sister dipped her quill in the red ink and made her notation in the ledger, her script as careful and precise as always, despite the tremor in her hand that came from exhaustion and sorrow in equal measure. The apothecary woman closed the nobleman's eyes with gentle fingers and drew the linen sheet up to cover his face, while the young monk whispered a prayer for the safe passage of souls and the comfort of those who mourn. She folded the velvet cloth with the same deliberate care with which she had unfolded it, enclosing the nobleman's final breath in its soft blue depths, and then she placed it in the wooden box where such cloths were kept until they could be taken to the chapel and offered upon the altar as tokens of lives that had passed from this world into whatever realm awaited beyond the threshold of mortality. The bell-ringer boy appeared in the doorway then, his face solemn with the weight of his responsibility, his hand already reaching for the rope that would ring the death bell twice to announce to all who might be listening that another soul had departed from the monastery turned hospital. The sound would carry across the water to the city beyond, where those who still lived would pause in their activities and offer whatever prayers they could remember for the peace of the dead and the strength of the living. As the second toll of the bell faded into the evening air, she rose from her chair and moved toward the door, her bare feet silent against the stone floor, her grey robe flowing around her like mist. The baker and the child still breathed, though both with the shallow rhythm that spoke of journeys soon to begin, and she would return to sit with them through the hours of darkness that lay ahead, ready to perform her sacred duty whenever the moment of departure arrived. The corridor was filled with the warm glow of the young monks' candles now, and the shadows danced upon the walls in patterns that seemed almost alive, almost purposeful in their movement. The air was thick with the scent of burning tallow and healing herbs, and beneath these familiar fragrances lay the deeper smell of stone and time, of centuries of prayer and service that had sanctified these walls, long before they had become a place for the collection of final breaths. She moved slowly down the corridor toward the chapel, where she would place the nobleman's breathcloth upon the altar and light a votive candle for his soul, adding its small flame to the dozens that already flickered before the painted image of the Virgin, whose face was serene with the particular peace of one who had witnessed all forms of human sorrow and found them not without meaning. The wind moved through the garden beyond the windows, stirring the wild rosemary and the scattered lettuce, carrying their mingled fragrances through the stone corridors and into the rooms where the dying lay upon their wooden cots, wrapped in wool blankets and linen sheets, waiting for their own moment of departure to arrive. And she walked among them like a gentle shadow, barefoot and silent, ready to receive whatever final gifts their departing souls might offer to the soft embrace of velvet cloth and the patient vigil of those who had chosen to serve in this most sacred and sorrowful of occupations. The chapel doors stood open before her, and the candlelight within cast long fingers of illumination into the corridor, beckoning her forward into the space where breath became prayer and prayer became memory, where the countless threads of individual lives were woven together into the larger tapestry of human experience that stretched back through centuries. Joy and suffering, hope and loss, love and letting go. She entered the sacred space and knelt before the altar, the nobleman's breathcloth cradled in her palms like an offering of incalculable worth, while around her the other candles burned with steady flame, and the painted saints looked down with eyes that had witnessed the full spectrum, experience, and found it all deserving of compassion. The stone floor was cool against her knees, and the silence was complete except for the soft whisper of her own breathing which continued its patient rhythm as she prepared to offer up the gift she had been given, the final breath of a life that had once walked in sunlight and now walked toward whatever lay beyond the horizon of mortal understanding. She kneels beside the nobleman. His hands tremble. A linen sheet rises and falls and stops. She waits. The boy rings the bell. Dawn came slowly to the monastery in the spring of 1349, seeping through the high windows like pale honey poured from a great height, pooling in the corners of rooms where shadows had gathered, through the long night hours, warming the limestone walls that held the coolness of centuries in their grey depths. The light was soft and diffused, filtered through the smoke of tallow candles that had burned through the darkness and the steam that rose from the clay vessels where the apothecary woman brewed her healing teas and therapeutic decoctions. She had returned to the southern wing before the first light touched the eastern windows, her bare feet carrying her silently along corridors that had grown familiar in the months since she had begun her work as a breath-taker. The nobleman's bed was empty now, his body carried away during the night hours to be prepared for burial in the mass grave that had been dug beyond the garden, where the earth was soft and the drainage was good and the lime could be scattered thick enough to hasten the return of flesh to dust. In his place lay another figure, this one a woman of perhaps 30 years, though the pestilence had aged her face in the way that great suffering ages all faces, adding lines and hollows where youth had once resided. Her hair was dark and had been carefully braided by whoever had brought her to this place, and her hands were work-worn in the manner of those who earn their bread through the labor of their bodies. The head sister's ledger would record her as a seamstress, one who had made her living with needle and thread until the sickness had stilled her hands and brought her to this bed of rough wood and clean linen. The seamstress breathed with the labored rhythm that had become so familiar to those who worked in these halls, each inhalation requiring visible effort, each exhalation carrying with it a faint sound, like the whisper of wind through dry leaves. Her fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her skin cool and pale as marble, and her eyes, when they opened, tell the distant look of one who was already beginning to see beyond the immediate world of stone walls and candlelight. She took her place in the wooden chair beside the bed, arranging her grey woolen robe around her legs and folding her hands in her lap in the manner that had become as natural as breathing. The velvet cloth lay ready on the small table, its deep blue surface catching what light there was and holding it like a fragment of night, sky captured between careful fingers. Beside it sat a small glass vial, no larger than a child's thumb, its surface clear and smooth and carefully blown by craftsmen whose skill had been passed down through generations of glassmakers working the furnaces of Murano. The glass vial was another tool of her trade, used when the breath to be collected came from those who had requested it specifically, those who believed that their final exhalation might carry with it some essence of their soul that could be preserved for their loved ones or offered as a relic for future veneration. The seamstress had made no such request, but the vial sat ready nonetheless, for sometimes the moment of departure brought with it unexpected possibilities, unexpected gifts that could not be anticipated but must be received with grace when they were offered. Through the window beside the seamstress's bed, she could see the garden where morning dew had settled upon the leaves of the wild herbs that grew there, each drop catching the early light and reflecting it back in tiny prisms of color that danced when the gentle wind moved through them. The rosemary was particularly beautiful in this light, its gray-green needles tipped with moisture that made them gleam, like small jewels scattered among the stones and pathways. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of the young monk, who came each morning with fresh candles to replace those that had burned through the night, and with bread and watered wine for those patients who were still able to take nourishment. His face was young, but marked by the gravity of his service, and his movements had acquired the particular carefulness of one who has learned that every gesture in the presence of the dying must be considered and purposeful. He entered the room with his arms full of supplies, setting down his wooden tray upon the table near the door, and beginning the careful process of replacing the burned-down candles with fresh ones, trimming the wicks with small iron scissors and adjusting the placement so that the light would fall evenly across the beds where the sick lay waiting. His movements were meditative in their precision, each action performed with the attention that the monks had once given to the copying of manuscripts or the tending of altar vessels. The seamstress turned her head slightly to watch him work, her eyes following his movements with the interest that comes when the ordinary world has acquired a heightened significance, when each gesture carries more meaning than it might have possessed in times of health and normalcy. Her lips moved occasionally in what might have been prayer, or might have been the recitation of some half-remembered song from her childhood, though the words were too soft to be understood by those who watched over her. In the bed across from the seamstress lay the baker-woman, who had been there when the nobleman died, her breathing now so shallow that the rise and fall of the wool blanket covering her chest was barely perceptible. Her flour-dusted hands remained motionless upon the coverlet, and her face had acquired the translucent quality that comes when the flesh begins to release its hold upon the spirit that has animated it for so many years. The loaf of bread that her family had brought still sat upon the table beside her bed, its golden crust now harder than it had been, but still carrying within it the essence of grain and yeast, and the skill of hands that had shaped countless loaves in the years before the pestilence had claimed her strength. The bread had become a kind of monument to her life, a tangible reminder of the work that had defined her days and the love that had motivated her labor. The child in the third bed had grown weaker during the night, his wheat-colored hair now damp with perspiration, and his large eyes seeming to take up even more of his thinned face. His grandfather had remained with him through the dark hours, sitting in a chair that had been brought from another room, his gnarled hands folded in prayer, and his voice occasionally rising in the strange dialect that no one could understand, but that carried within it the unmistakable cadence of love and loss intertwined. The old man looked up as she entered the room, his eyes meeting hers with the recognition of one who understood the nature of her work and the service She provided to those who stood upon the threshold between this world and whatever lay beyond. He nodded slightly, a gesture that carried within it both gratitude and sorrow, acknowledgement and acceptance of what was to come. His presence brought a warmth to the room that had little to do with temperature and everything to do with the fierce tenderness that connects one human heart to another across the vast spaces of mortality. The apothecary woman appeared in the doorway then, her arms carrying fresh supplies of herbs and medicines, her leather gloves replaced with clean ones that had been soaked in vinegar and dried in the sun. Her face mask was perfumed with oils of peppermint and rosemary, and her movements showed the efficient grace of one who had adapted quickly to the rhythms and requirements of this transformed place. She had been a healer before the pestilence came, tending to the ordinary ailments of ordinary people. But her skills had proven valuable in these extraordinary circumstances. She moved first to the baker woman's bedside, checking the pulse at her throat with gentle fingers and listening to the sound of her breathing with the experienced attention of one who could read in these vital signs, to a story of what was happening within the secret chambers of heart and lung. Her touch was light and careful, informed by both medical knowledge and human compassion, and when she looked up from her examination, her eyes carried the quiet communication that passes between those who work in the presence of death. The seamstress stirred slightly as the apothecary woman approached her bed, her eyes opening to focus with effort upon the masked face that bent over her. Recognition flickered there, along with something that might have been gratitude for the care she was receiving in this place, where she had come to die among strangers who nevertheless treated her with the dignity that every human soul deserves in its final hours. "Water," the seamstress whispered, her voice barely audible but clear enough to be understood by those who had learned to listen for such requests. The apothecary woman nodded and reached for the wooden cup that sat upon the bedside table, lifting it to the dying woman's lips with steady hands and allowing her to sip slowly from the clean water that had been drawn from the monastery's well. The water seemed to bring some small measure of comfort to the seamstress, and she settled back against her pillow with a sigh that carried within it both relief and resignation. Her breathing continued its labored pattern, but there was a subtle change in its quality now, a gentleness that had not been there before, as though she had made some inner decision about the journey she was about to undertake. The young monk finished his work with the candles and moved to the child's bedside, where he knelt upon the stone floor and began to recite in Latin the prayers for those who were gravely ill. His voice soft but clear, each syllable shaped with the precision that comes from long practice and deep reverence. The Latin words filled the room with their ancient cadences, connecting this moment to centuries of similar moments, times when other voices had spoken these same words over other beds, where other souls had prepared for departure. The child's eyes fixed upon the young monk's face as he prayed, and something passed between them that was deeper than language. A recognition of the sacred nature of what was occurring within these limestone walls. The boy's lips moved in echo of the prayers, though whether he understood the words or was simply comforted by their rhythm was impossible to know. His grandfather leaned forward slightly, his own lips joining in the familiar syllables of prayers he had learned in his own childhood, when the world had been a different place and death had seemed a more distant prospect. The light in the room continued to strengthen as the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky, and the rectangles of illumination that fell through the window shifted slowly across the floor, their edges sharp and their interiors filled with dancing dust motes that caught and reflected the light like tiny stars in a golden universe. The warmth of the sunlight began to penetrate the stone walls, driving away some of the chill that had settled there during the night hours. The seamstress turned her head toward the window, her eyes focusing with effort upon the garden beyond, where the wild herbs grew in their pleasing patterns among the stones and pathways. Her breathing had become even more labored now, each inhalation requiring greater effort, each exhalation carrying with it more of the sound that indicated the approach of the final threshold. She felt the familiar shift in her own breathing, the way her lungs seemed to echo the struggle that was taking place in the seamstress's chest, and she reached for the velvet cloth that lay folded upon the table beside her. The blue fabric was soft against her fingers, warmed by the candlelight and perfumed with the incense that had been burned in the chapel during the night hours. She unfolded it carefully, her movements deliberate and unhurried, for this work required patience above all other virtues. Head sister entered the room as she always did when the moment of departure drew near, her great ledger held against her chest and her quill, the dark as garnets and bright as fresh blood, waiting to record another name in the careful script that had become the chronicle of this place's transformed purpose. Her face showed the weariness that comes from too many nights of broken sleep and too many names written in sorrowful ink. But her presence brought order and dignity to what might otherwise have been merely an ending. The apothecary woman took her position on the opposite side of the seamstress's bed, her gloved hands ready to provide whatever comfort that to read the subtle signs that preceded departure, the changes in color and breathing and pulse that marked the soul's preparation for its journey beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone and blood. The young monk continued his prayers, his voice a gentle counterpoint to sounds of labored breathing and the soft rustle of linen as bodies shifted slightly upon their wooden beds. The Latin words seemed to weave themselves into the very air of the room, creating an atmosphere of sacred waiting that transformed these final moments from mere biological process into something approaching ceremony, something that honored the mystery of the boundary between life and death. The seamstress's breathing grew shallower still, and her eyes began to lose their focus upon the immediate world of walls and windows and faces bent over her in concern. Her hands, which had been work-worn and marked by the countless pricks of needles and the stains of thread and fabric dye, lay motionless now upon the wool blanket, palm upward in a gesture that seemed to indicate acceptance of whatever was to come. The silence in the room deepened until even the soft sounds from the corridor outside seemed to fade into insignificance, as though the entire monastery had drawn breath and was holding it in anticipation of what was about to occur. The candle flames burned steadier in this stillness, their light falling upon faces that had grown solemn with the weight of witness, upon hands that were ready to perform the small rituals that would mark the transition from one state of being to another. Her chest rose one final time, a slow and deliberate lifting that gathered all the remaining strength in her body. And then it fell with a whisper that was barely audible but unmistakable in its finality. She moved the velvet cloth forward in that precise moment, positioning it above the seamstress's parted lips to catch the final breath as it escaped from the lungs. That had served this life for 30 years of labor and love and ordinary human struggle. The cloths seemed to stir slightly as the last exhalation passed through it, and then it was still, holding within its blue depths the invisible essence of a life that had been lived with purpose and skill, with care for the beauty that could be created by careful hands, guided by patient eyes. She held the cloth there for several heartbeats, while the silence settled around them like a gentle blanket, marking the end of one story and the beginning of whatever story might come next. The head sister dipped her quill in the red ink and made her careful notation in the great ledger, recording the seamstress's name and the hour of her departure in script that was as precise and beautiful as the work that the dead woman had once done with needle and thread. The apothecary woman closed the seamstress's eyes with fingers that were gentle despite their leather gloves, and drew the linen sheet up to cover the face that had been marked by both suffering and peace. The young monk finished his prayers with words that spoke of safe passage and eternal rest, his voice carrying the confidence that comes from faith in mysteries that cannot be explained but can be trusted. The child in the third bed had watched all of this with eyes that seemed to understand far more than his years should have allowed, and his grandfather held his small hand while tears moved slowly down the channels that age and weather had carved in his cheeks. She folded the velvet cloth with the same deliberate care with which she had unfolded it, enclosing the seamstress's final breath in its soft embrace. And then she placed it in the wooden box where such cloths were kept, until they could be taken to the chapel and offered upon the altar as tokens of lives that had been lived with dignity and were ending with grace. The bell-ringer boy appeared in the doorway then, his young face serious with the responsibility of his task, his hand already reaching for the rope that would announce to all who might be listening that another soul had departed from this place of healing and dying. The death bell rang twice across the water, its bronze voice carrying the news to the city beyond, where those who still lived would pause in their activities to offer whatever prayers they could remember for the peace of the dead and the strength of the living. As the sound of the bell faded into the morning air, she rose from her chair and moved toward the baker-woman's bed, where the breathing had grown so shallow as to be almost imperceptible, where the flour-dusted hands lay still and the translucent face turned slightly toward the window where the light fell in golden rectangles across the stone floor. The young monk brought fresh candles to replace those that had burned low during the vigil, and the apothecary woman prepared her herbs and medicines for whatever comfort they might provide in the hours ahead. The head sister remained nearby with her ledger and her red ink, ready to record whatever names might need to be written before the day was done. And in the third bed, the child with the wheat-colored hair and the large eyes watched it all with the gravity of one who was learning lessons that no child should have to learn, while his grandfather held his hand and whispered prayers in the dialect that carried within it all the love and loss of a long life lived in faithfulness to whatever gods watched over the small villages where bread was baked and children played and death came in its own time, in its own season, with its own particular gifts and sorrows. The morning light grew stronger, driving the shadows back into the corners, where they would wait through the day for evening to come and restore them to their rightful place in the rhythm of light and darkness that governed all things, both the living and the dead, both the breath that continued and the breath that was gathered in soft blue cloth and carried to the chapel where candles burned before painted saints who had once walked in flesh and now walked in mystery, watching over those who served in the presence of the great threshold that all souls must eventually cross. The head sister dips the quill, a new name, a lost name. The apothecary returns with rosemary. The monk reads from memory. The great ledger lay open upon the wooden desk in the head sister's chamber, its cream-colored pages marked with careful script in red ink that caught the light from the oil lamp and seemed to glow like small coals against the pale background. Each name had been written with the same meticulous care, each date recorded with the precision that had once been devoted to documenting the spiritual milestones of a community devoted to prayer and contemplation, but which now served to chronicle the passage of souls through this place that had been transformed by necessity into a hospice for those whom the pestilence had claimed. Sister Margarita had been keeper of records for nearly 20 years before the plague reached the shores of the Venetian lagoon, and her script had recorded hundreds of joyous occasions: the arrival of new novices, the celebration of feast days, the blessing of harvests from the monastery garden, the visits of pilgrims who had come seeking spiritual refreshment in this place of ancient stones and patient prayer. Now her careful hand wrote only names and dates of departure, each entry a small monument to a life that had been lived and was now concluded. Each mark of the quill a recognition of the dignity that belonged to every human soul, regardless of the circumstances of its passing. The red ink had been chosen deliberately, for it was the color of blood and therefore the color of life, and it seemed appropriate that the final record of each person's existence should be marked in this most vital of hues. The ink was made from cinnabar and gum arabic, mixed with wine that had been blessed by the monastery's chaplain, and its deep scarlet color seemed to pulse with its own inner light as it dried upon the cream-colored pages. She had written 3 names since dawn: the seamstress, whose final breath had been caught in blue velvet as the morning light fell through the windows of the southern wing, and before her the nobleman whose departure had been marked by the ringing of the death bell in the deepening twilight of the previous evening. The third name belonged to an old woman who had died in the northern wing during the night hours, her passing so quiet that it had been discovered only when the youngest of the breath-takers had come to check upon her in the grey time before sunrise. Each name carried with it a story that would never be fully recorded in the ledger's careful columns. Stories of childhood summers and first loves, of marriages celebrated and children born, of harvests gathered and bread baked and cloth woven in patterns that had been passed down through generations of patient hands. These stories lived now only in the memories of those who had known the departed. And as the pestilence continued its slow march across the Italian peninsula, even those memories would eventually be lost to time and silence. The head sister set down her quill and flexed her fingers, which had grown stiff from the careful work of forming letters and numbers with the precision that this sacred task required. The chamber where she worked was small and spartanly furnished, with whitewashed walls and a single window that looked out upon the cloister where the monks had once walked in contemplation, their footsteps wearing smooth paths in the stone that now served as walkways for those who tended the sick and dying. Through that window now came the sound of footsteps, not the measured pace of monastic contemplation, but the purposeful movement of the apothecary woman returning from her morning journey to the herb garden that lay beyond the monastery walls. She carried with her fresh supplies of rosemary and sage, thyme and lavender, plants whose healing properties had been known since ancient times, and whose fragrance might provide some comfort to those who lay upon the wooden cots throughout the converted monastery. The apothecary woman's name was Alina, though she was rarely called by name in this place, where individual identity had been somewhat subsumed into function and purpose. She had come to the monastery in the early days of the pestilence, when the first cases had been brought across the water from the city, and the monks had realized that their community would need to transform itself if it were to serve the needs of the sufferings. Her knowledge of healing herbs and her steady temperament had made her invaluable in these circumstances, though she carried within her the sorrow of one who had lost family members to the very disease she now sought to ease. Alina entered the head sister's chamber with her arms full of fresh herbs, dye green fragrance, filling the small room with the scent of growing things, of life persisting even in the presence of so much death. She set her burden upon the wooden table near the window and began the careful process of sorting the plants according to their properties and intended uses. Rosemary for the purification of air, sage for the cleansing of wounds, thyme for the strengthening of breath, lavender for the calming of spirits that might be agitated by pain or fear. The child, Alina said softly, her voice carrying the particular tone that was used in this place when speaking of those who were approaching their final hours. His breathing has changed. The grandfather asks if you might come and make the record ready. Sister Margarita nodded and reached for her quill, dipping it in the red ink that gleamed in its small pot like liquid garnets. The child's name was already known to her, Pietro, son of a stone-cutter who had died of the pestilence 3 weeks earlier, grandson of the old man who had carried him here in his arms and had remained by his bedside ever since, keeping vigil with the fierce devotion that grandparents bring to the care of their descendants. Preci had learned the story from the old man himself, who had spoken in broken Latin mixed with his regional dialect, his hands gesturing as he tried to make himself understood to those who would care for his grandson in what might be the boy's final days. Pietro had been a bright child, quick with numbers and eager to learn the craft of his father's trade, shaping limestone blocks with tools that had been too heavy for his small hands, but which he had insisted on trying to use nonetheless. The old man had brought with him a small carved stone that Pietro had made in imitation of his father's work, a rough angel with wings that were more suggestion than detail, face that was barely indicated by shallow cuts in the soft limestone. It was clearly the work of a child, but it carried within it the echo of skill that might have developed into mastery if time and pestilence had not intervened. The carved angel sat now upon the table beside Pietro's bed, watching over him with eyes that were barely visible in the stone, but seemed nonetheless to hold something like compassion. Sister Margherita rose from her desk and followed Elena through the corridors toward the southern wing, where the child lay in the bed he had occupied for nearly a week. The morning light was stronger now, falling through the high windows in broad rectangles that illuminated the stone floors and cast long shadows in the corners, where the walls met at right, angles worn smooth by centuries of weather and use. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly in the corridor, joining with the other sounds that had become familiar in this place. The rustle of wool blankets as patients shifted in their beds, the soft murmur of prayers spoken in various dialects, the crackle of tallow candles burning in their brass holders, the gentle scrape of wooden spoons against clay bowls, as those who were still able took whatever nourishment could be provided. In the room where Pietro lay, the atmosphere had taken on the particular quality that preceded departure, a sense of gathering that was felt rather than seen, as though invisible witnesses were assembling to observe the mystery that was about to unfold. The young monk knelt beside the child's bed, his lips moving in silent prayer, his face marked by the sorrow that comes when death claims those who have barely begun to live. The grandfather sat in his wooden chair with Pietro's small hand clasped in both of his own, his weathered face wet with tears that fell without sound or shame. For he had learned in his long life that there were sorrows too deep for any expression, except the simple acknowledgement of loss. His voice rose and fell in the strange dialect that none of the others could understand, but which clearly carried within it all the love and blessing that one generation could offer to the next across the vast spaces of mortality. The breath-taker sat in her chair on the opposite side of the bed, her grey robe arranged around her in careful folds, her breathing synchronized to the child's as she had learned to do in the months since she had begun this work. Her face was serene with the acceptance that comes from intimate familiarity with the process of departure, but her eyes held the particular gentleness that was reserved for the very young and the very old, those who stood at the beginning or end of the great journey of human life. Pietro's breathing had indeed changed, becoming rapid and shallow in the way that indicated the body's final efforts to maintain the delicate balance that keeps the spirit anchored in flesh. His wheat-colored hair was damp with perspiration, and his large eyes moved restlessly, as though he were watching things that others could not see. Perhaps glimpses of whatever realm awaited beyond the threshold he was approaching. Sister Margherita took her place near the foot of the bed, her ledger held ready against her chest, her quill poised above the page, where Pietro's name would soon join the others who had departed from this place. The red ink waited in its small pot, patient as blood, ready to mark another conclusion to another brief story of human existence, lived in the shadow, plore of circumstances beyond any individual's control. Alina moved quietly around the room, checking on the other patients who shared this space with the dying child. The baker woman had grown weaker still during the morning hours, her breathing so soft that it barely stirred the wool blanket that covered her chest, her flour-dusted hands completely motionless now upon the coverlet. The bread that her family had brought still sat upon her bedside table, its golden crust now hard as stone, but still carrying within it the essence of grain and skill and maternal love. The young monk's prayers grew more audible as Pietro's condition continued to deteriorate, his Latin words flowing over the childlike water over stones, each syllable shaped with the care that comes from understanding, that words spoken to the dying must carry within them all the comfort that human speech can provide. The prayers were ancient, ones recited over countless deathbeds throughout the centuries, connecting this moment to the vast chain of human experience that stretched back through time to the very beginning of consciousness itself. Through the window beside Pietro's bed, the garden was visible in the strengthening morning light, its wild herbs growing in patterns that pleased the eye even without the careful cultivation they had once received. The rosemary was particularly fragrant in the warming air, its grey-green needles releasing their purifying scent whenever the gentle breeze moved through them, creating an atmosphere of natural incense that seemed appropriate to the sacred nature of what was occurring within the limestone walls. The light fell across Pietro's face as his breathing grew more labored still, and for a moment his eyes seemed to focus upon something beyond the immediate confines of the room, something that brought to his young features an expression of wonder rather than fear. His lips moved in what might have been an attempt to speak, though no sound emerged except the soft whisper of breath moving in and out of lungs that were growing weary of their essential task. The grandfather leaned forward, bringing his ear close to the child's mouth, as though he might be able to catch some final word, some message that Pietro might wish to send to those who would remain behind when his journey was complete. But there were no words, only the increasingly shallow rhythm of breathing that marked the approach of the final threshold, the boundary between the known and the unknowable that every human soul must eventually cross. Sister Margherita felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always came when she witnessed the departure of the very young. For there was something particularly poignant about lives that were concluded before they had been fully lived, stories that were ended before their plots had been allowed to develop and reach their natural conclusions. Yet she had learned in her years of keeping records that every life, regardless of its length, contained within it a complete story, a full measure of meaning that was not dependent upon duration for its significance. The breath taker reached for her velvet cloth, unfolding it with movements that had become as natural as breathing itself. Her fingers handling the soft blue fabric with a reverence that befitted its sacred purpose. The cloth had been blessed multiple times, sprinkled with holy water, and touched two relics that were believed to carry within them the spiritual essence of saints who had walked this earth centuries before, their own lives offering examples of how human existence could be transformed into something approaching the divine. Pietro's chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty, each breath requiring greater effort, each pause between breaths growing longer as his body began the final process of releasing its hold upon the spirit that had animated it for 8 brief years. His small hand tightened slightly around his grandfather's weathered fingers, a gesture that might have been conscious, or might have been simply the body's automatic response to the stress of dying. The silence in the room deepened until it seemed to have physical presence, pressing against the walls and rising toward the vaulted ceiling like incense or prayer. Even the sounds from other rooms seemed to fade into insignificance, as though the entire monastery had paused to acknowledge what was about to occur in this small space where a child lay, dying among strangers who had nonetheless come to care for him, as though he were their own. His breathing stopped then, so suddenly that it seemed as though time itself had paused, and in that moment of perfect stillness, the breath taker moved forward with the velvet cloth, positioning it above Pietro's parted lips to receive whatever final gift his departing soul might offer to those who had chosen to serve in this most sacred of occupations. The cloth stirred slightly as his last breath passed through it, and then it was completely still, holding within its blue depths the invisible essence of a young life that had been lived with curiosity and courage, despite the circumstances that had brought it to such an early conclusion. The grandfather's sobs filled the silence, then raw sounds of grief that seemed to echo off the limestone walls and rise toward heaven-like prayers that were too deep for words. His weathered hands held Pietro's small one for a long time after the breathing had stopped, as though physical contact might somehow bridge the gap between life and death, between presence and absence, between the known and the unknowable. Sister Margarita dipped her quill in the red ink and wrote Pietro's name in her careful script, marking the date and hour of his departure with the same meticulous precision she had always brought to her record-keeping, though now each entry carried a weight of sorrow that had not been present in the days when her ledger had recorded only celebrations and spiritual milestones. The ink seemed darker than usual as it dried upon the cream-colored page, as though it carried within it some essence of the grief that filled this room. The young monk concluded his prayers with words that spoke of safe passage for young souls and comfort for those who mourned there. Departure, his voice carrying the confidence that comes from faith in mysteries that cannot be explained but can be trusted. Alina approached the bed and gently closed Pietro's eyes, her movements tender despite the leather gloves that protected her hands. And then she drew the linen sheet up to cover the face that had been marked by both suffering and an innocence. that even death could not diminish. The breath-taker folded her velvet cloth with the same deliberate care she had always shown, enclosing Pietro's final breath in its soft embrace, before placing it in the wooden box where such sacred objects were kept until they could be taken to the chapel and offered upon the altar as tokens of lives that had been lived with dignity and were ending with grace. The blue fabric seemed to glow softly in the candlelight, as though it carried within it some reflection of the spirit it had been privileged to receive. The bell-ringer boy appeared in the doorway, as he always did when his services were required, his young face solemn with the responsibility of announcing another departure to all who might be listening. The death bell rang twice across the water, its bronze voice carrying the news to the city beyond, where those who still lived would pause in their activities to offer whatever prayers they could remember for the peace of the dead and the strength of the living. As the sound of the bell faded into the morning air, Sister Margherita remained in the room for a few moments longer, her ledger closed now, but held against her chest like a shield against the sorrow that threatened to overwhelm even those who had grown accustomed to loss. She watched as the grandfather continued to hold his grandson's hand, his tears falling upon the linen sheet that covered the small body, his voice still rising and falling in the dialect that carried within it generations of love and loss, hope and heartbreak. Elena began the careful process of preparing Pietro's body for burial, her movements efficient but reverent, informed by both practical necessity and human compassion. The carved stone angel that the child had made sat upon the table beside the bed, its rough features seeming to watch over the proceedings with eyes that were barely visible in the limestone, but somehow conveyed a sense of protective presence. The young monk gathered his prayer book and prepared to move on to the other rooms where his services might be needed. For death did not pause to allow for extended grief, and there were others in this place who would soon require the comfort of familiar prayers spoken in familiar cadences. His face showed the particular weariness that comes from witnessing too much sorrow in too short a time, but his step remained steady as he prepared to continue his rounds through the corridors of this place that had been transformed by necessity into a hospice for those whom the pestilence had claimed. And in the bed next to where Pietro had died, the baker woman continued her own journey toward departure, her breathing now so soft as to be barely perceptible, her flour-dusted hands completely still upon the wool blanket that covered her chest. The bread that her family had brought continued to sit upon her bedside table, a monument to a life lived in service to the basic human need for nourishment, a tangible reminder of skills that had been passed down through generations and would soon be lost unless others could be found to carry them forward. Sister Margherita opened her ledger once more and prepared to write another name. Her quill poised above a fresh page where red ink would soon mark another conclusion to another story of human existence, lived in the shadow of circumstances beyond any individual's control. The morning light continued to strengthen outside the windows, driving away the cool shadows that had gathered during the night hours, bringing warmth to the stone walls that had held the coolness of centuries within their pale grey depths. The rhythm of life and death continued its ancient pattern within these transformed walls. marked by the careful script of those who served as witnesses to the great mystery of departure, chronicled in red ink that gleamed like garnets against cream-colored pages, recorded with the precision that had once been devoted to documenting celebrations and was now employed in the service of commemorating conclusions. Each name a small monument to the dignity that belonged to every human soul, regardless of the circumstances of its passage from this world to whatever realm awaited beyond the threshold that all must eventually cross. In the west wing. The windows stay shut. The air is still. The younger breath taker leaves her cloth folded. One patient stirs, and then doesn't. The west wing of the monastery had been built to catch the afternoon sun, its windows facing toward the lagoon, where the light would reflect off the water in the later hours of the day and fill the rooms with golden illumination that had once warmed the chambers where the monks had pursued their scholarly work, copying manuscripts and illuminating pages with colors ground from precious minerals and plant dyes. Now those same windows remained shuttered against the outside world, their heavy wooden panels closed tight to contain the stagnant air that seemed to hover in these rooms like a presence that was both invisible and oppressive. The stillness in the west wing was different from the quiet that prevailed in other parts of the monastery, deeper and more complete, as though the very air had grown thick with the weight of too many final breaths exhaled into its confined spaces. Here even the sound of footsteps seemed muted, absorbed by the stone walls and heavy timber ceiling beams that had supported this structure for more than 2 centuries, witnessing the passage of countless seasons and the transformation of the buildings. Purpose from spiritual contemplation to the accommodation of human suffering. She moved through this wing more slowly than she moved through the others, not because her duties here were different, but because the atmosphere itself seemed to require a more measured pace, a more deliberate attention to the subtle signs that indicated the approach of departure. The youngest of the breath takers walked beside her, learning through observation and quiet instruction the rhythms and requirements of this most sacred work, her own breathing synchronized to the patterns they encountered in room after room, where the dying lay upon their wooden cots. The younger woman's name was Katerina, though, like the others who served in this capacity, she was rarely called by name, but was known simply by her function and purpose. She had come to this work only recently, arriving at the monastery just as the spring rains were beginning to soften the earth in the gardens, and the first new growth was appearing. Among the wild herbs that had claimed the abandoned plots, her hands were still uncertain with the velvet cloths and glass vials, still learning the precise timing that was required to capture the final breath at the moment of its release. In the first room of the west wing, 3 beds held patients whose conditions had grown critical during the night hours. The air here was particularly heavy, thick with the exhalations of labored breathing and the smoke of herbs that the apothecary woman burned in small clay vessels to purify the atmosphere and provide whatever comfort their fragrance might bring to those who lay waiting for their journeys to begin. The first bed was occupied by a merchant who had been brought from the city 3 days earlier. his clothing rich but travel-stained, his hands soft with the particular softness that comes from a lifetime of handling coins and documents rather than tools or soil. His breathing was rapid and shallow, each inhalation accompanied by a sound like the whisper of wind through dry reeds, and his eyes moved restlessly beneath closed lids, as though he were seeing things that existed beyond the immediate world of stone walls and shuttered windows. Beside his bed sat a woman who might have been his wife or daughter, her face marked by the particular exhaustion that comes from maintaining vigil over someone whose life hangs suspended between one heartbeat and the next. She had been there since his arrival, leaving only when absolutely necessary, her hands folded in prayer or resting gently upon his forehead in gestures meant to provide comfort to both the dying and the living. The second bed held a young woman whose age was difficult to determine, for the pestilence had aged her face in the way that great suffering ages all faces, adding lines and shadows that spoke of pain endured and strength slowly depleted. Her hair had been braided carefully by whoever had brought her to this place, and the braids lay like dark ribbons against the white linen of her pillow, providing a stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. The third patient was an elderly man whose breathing was so soft that it barely stirred the wool blanket that covered his chest. His hands folded upon his stomach in the peaceful posture of one who had made his peace with whatever was to come. His face showed the serenity that sometimes comes in the final stages of life, when the struggle against death gives way to acceptance of its inevitability, when the spirit begins to prepare itself for the journey that awaits beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. Katerina moved uncertainly between the beds, her young face marked by the concentration of one who was still learning to read the subtle signs that indicated the approach of departure. Her breathing was not yet perfectly synchronized to the rhythms she encountered, and her movements with the sacred cloths still lacked the fluid certainty that would come only with experience and time. The older breath-taker watched her student with patient attention, ready to provide guidance when necessary, but understanding that some aspects of this work could be learned only through direct experience, through the gradual development of sensitivity to the invisible currents that moved between the living and the dying. Her own movements were assured and graceful, informed by months of practice and deepened by the understanding that had come from witnessing hundreds of departures. The light that filtered through the cracks between the shuttered windows was dim and diffused, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that seemed appropriate to the nature of the work being performed within these walls. The shadows were deep and seemed to possess their own weight and substance, gathering in the corners where walls met at angles worn smooth by centuries of weather and use. From somewhere in the building came the sound of the young monk's voice, reading from scripture in Latin that flowed over the stone corridors like water over well-worn channels, each syllable shaped with the precision that comes from long practice and deep reverence for the mysteries being proclaimed. His words seemed to penetrate even the heavy stillness of the west wing, bringing with them a sense of connection to the larger pattern of faith and hope that had sustained this community through all the transformations that necessity had imposed upon its original purpose. The merchant's breathing grew more labored as the morning progressed toward noon, and his restless movements gradually stilled until he lay, motionless, except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest beneath the wool blanket. The woman who maintained vigil beside his bed leaned forward slightly, her hand reaching out to touch his forehead with fingers that trembled with exhaustion and grief in equal measure. Caterina approached the merchant's bedside with her velvet cloth in hand, but her movements were hesitant, uncertain about the proper timing for the performance of her sacred duty. The older breath-taker moved to stand beside her student, her presence providing reassurance and guidance without the need for words that might disturb the solemn atmosphere of the room. The silence deepened around them until even the sound of their own breathing seemed loud in the stillness, and the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation of what was about to occur. The merchant's chest rose one final time, a movement so slight that it might have been missed by one less experienced in reading the signs of departure, and then it was completely still. But Caterina did not move forward with her cloth, her uncertainty causing Perm to hesitate at the crucial moment when the final breath should have been captured in blue velvet and preserved as a token of the life that had just concluded. The older breath-taker waited for several heartbeats, allowing her student the opportunity to complete the task she had been trained to perform. But when the moment passed without action, she stepped forward and gently took the cloth from Caterina's hands. Yet even as she positioned the velvet above the merchant's parted lips, she knew that the moment had passed, that the final breath had already been released into the heavy air of the room, and could no longer be captured and preserved. The cloth remained motionless, holding within its blue depth only the ordinary air that filled the space between the living and the dead, empty of the invisible essence that gave such cloths their sacred significance. The woman who had maintained vigil beside the merchant's bed began to weep then, her sobs filling the silence with raw sounds of grief that seemed to echo off the stone walls and rise toward the timber ceiling beams that had witnessed so many similar scenes in the months since the monastery had been transformed into a place of healing and dying. Her tears fell upon the merchant's still face, and her hands reached out to touch his hair with the desperate tenderness of one who was trying to hold onto something that was already gone. Sister Margarita appeared in the doorway, as she always did when death had visited one of the rooms under her care, her great ledger held against her chest, and her face showing the weariness that came from too many names written in red ink, too many stories concluded before their proper time. She entered the room with the quiet dignity that had become her hallmark in these transformed circumstances, her presence bringing order and reverence to what might otherwise have been merely another ending. The head sister's eyes took in the scene before her, the still figure upon the bed, the grieving woman beside him, the two breath-takers standing with empty cloth in their hands, and she understood immediately what had occurred. Her face showed no judgment of Caterina's failure to perform her duty at the proper moment, for she had seen similar hesitations before in those who were new to this work, and she knew that The learning of such skills required time and patience and compassion for human frailty. She moved to the small table beside the merchant's bed and opened her ledger to a fresh page, dipping her quill in the red ink that gleamed like liquid garnets in its small pot. The merchant's name was recorded there, along with the date and hour of his departure, each letter formed with the same meticulous care that had once been devoted to documenting celebrations and spiritual or milestones, but which now served to chronicle conclusions and farewells. Alina appeared in the room as well, her arms carrying fresh supplies of herbs and medicines, her face masked against the heavy air that seemed to cling to the walls and ceiling of the west wing like an unwelcome presence. She moved first to check on the other two patients in the room, her gloved hands gentle as they felt for pulses and listened to the sound of breathing. That continued its ancient rhythm in defiance of the stillness that had claimed their companion. The young woman in the second bed stirred slightly as Alina approached, her eyes opening to focus with difficulty upon the masked face that bent over her. Recognition flickered there, along with something that might have been gratitude for the care she was receiving in this place where she had come to die among strangers who nevertheless treated her with dignity and compassion. The elderly man in the third bed remained peaceful in his apparent sleep, his breathing so soft that it barely disturbed the wool blanket that covered him, his face showing the serenity that sometimes comes when the struggle against death gives way to acceptance of whatever transformation awaits beyond the threshold of mortal understanding. Katerina stood beside the merchant's bed with tears streaming down her young face, her hands trembling with the realization of her failure to perform the sacred duty for which she had been trained. The older breath-taker moved to stand beside her student, her presence providing comfort and reassurance without the need for words. That might increase the younger woman's sense of shame and inadequacy. "The breath is not always meant to be caught," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to be understood by those who listened with a particular attention that comes when wisdom is being shared by one who has learned through long experience. Sometimes the soul departs with such swiftness that no human hand can capture what it chooses to release without ceremony or delay. Her words carried the weight of months spent in the presence of the dying, witnessing departures that followed no predictable pattern. Learning that the work of a breath-taker required not only skill and timing, but also acceptance of the mysteries that governed the moment when spirit separated itself from flesh and began its journey toward whatever realm awaited beyond the boundaries of earthly existence. The merchant's wife, for that was clearly her relationship to the departed man, continued to weep over his still form, her grief filling the heavy air of the room with sounds that seemed to carry within them all the sorrow that accumulates when love encounters the absolute finality of death. Her hands moved over his face and hair with gestures that spoke of decades of shared life, of intimacy interrupted by circumstances beyond any human power to control or alter. Sister Margarita completed her entry in the great ledger and closed the book with a soft sound that seemed final in its implications, marking the end of one more story of human existence lived in the shadow of pestilence and concluded in a room where the windows remained shuttered against the outside world. She offered what comfort she could to the grieving widow, her words gentle but limited, for she had learned that in the presence of such profound loss, silence often provided more solace than speech. Alina began the process of preparing the merchant's body for burial, her movements efficient but reverent, informed by both practical necessity and human compassion. The heavy air of the west wing seemed to press down upon all those present, reminding them of their own mortality and the temporary nature of all human arrangements and aspirations. The young woman in the second bed watched these proceedings with eyes that seemed to understand far more than her fevered condition should have allowed. Her face marked by the particular gravity that comes when the living are forced to contemplate their own approaching departure. Her breathing had grown more labored during the morning hours, each inhalation requiring visible effort, each exhalation carrying with bite a sound like wind moving through distant forests. Katerina remained beside the merchant's bed long after the others had completed their tasks and moved on to attend to the needs of the living. Her young face marked by the weight of lessons learned through failure as much as through success. The folded velvet cloth in her hands seemed heavier now, burdened with the responsibility of sacred work and the knowledge that such work required not only technical skill, but also the development of sensitivity to mysteries that could not be taught, but only experienced and absorbed through patient attention to the rhythms of life and death. The older breath-taker waited nearby, ready to provide guidance and support when her student was ready to receive it, understanding that some aspects of this calling required solitary contemplation and the working through of emotions that could not be shared or explained to others who had not faced similar challenges and failures. The light in the west wing remained dim and diffused throughout the day, filtered through shuttered windows that kept the rooms in perpetual twilight, creating an atmosphere that seemed suspended between day and night, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The heavy air continued to press down upon those who moved through these corridors, reminding them with each breath they took of the precious and temporary nature of the gift of life. As afternoon moved toward evening, the young woman in the second bed began to show signs that her own departure was approaching, her breathing growing shallower and more irregular, her face taking on the translucent quality that comes when the flesh begins to release its hold upon the spirit that has animated it for so many years. Katerina approached her bedside with renewed determination, her velvet cloth unfolded and ready, her breathing synchronized to the dying woman's, as she had been taught to do. This time, when the final moment arrived, she was ready for it, positioning the blue fabric above the woman's parted lips with movements that were sure and reverent, catching the last whisper of breath as it passed from mortal lungs into the preservation of sacred cloth. The velvet stirred lightly with the passage of that final exhalation, and then it was still, holding within its soft depths the invisible essence of a life that had been lived with courage, and was ending with dignity. The silence that followed seemed less heavy than before, as though Caterina's successful completion of her sacred duty had somehow lightened the oppressive atmosphere that had pressed down upon the West Wing throughout the day. She folded the cloth with careful hands, her movements now showing the confidence that comes from understanding properly performed, from the knowledge that she had served as a worthy vessel for the reception of a departing soul's final gift to the world of the living. Sister Margarita returned to record another name in red ink, her quill moving across the cream-colored page with practiced precision, marking the conclusion of another story of human existence, lived in circumstances that no previous generation had been required to face. The great ledger grew heavier with each entry, weighted down by the accumulated stories of lives interrupted by pestilence and concluded in rooms where the windows remained shuttered against the outside world. And in the third bed, the elderly man continued his peaceful breathing, his face serene with the acceptance that sometimes comes at the end of a long life lived with purpose and meaning, his hands folded upon his chest, in the posture of one who was ready for whatever transformation awaited him in the hours ahead. The heavy air of the West Wing pressed down upon them all, but it no longer seemed quite so oppressive, softened perhaps by the successful performance of sacred duty and the knowledge that even in failure, learning could occur and wisdom could be gained through patient attention to the mysteries that governed the boundary between life and death. The last night, only 5 beds remain. No more ink. The breath-taker curls her fingers. The vial is sealed. The bell rings once, then silence. The dome of the monastery's chapel had been built in the days when architects still remembered the secrets of Roman engineering, its curved surface rising above the altar like a stone heaven that contained within its circumference all the prayers and lamentations that had been offered in this sacred space over the course of more than 2 centuries. The afternoon light that fell through the high windows created patterns of gold and shadow that moved slowly across the curved interior surface. And in the chamber that had been built beneath this dome, 5 beds remained, occupied by those who had not yet completed their final journeys. This room had once been the sacristy, where the sacred vessels had been kept, and where the priests had prepared themselves for the celebration of the mysteries that connected earth to heaven through ritual and prayer. Now it served as the final ward of the monastery-turned-hospital, reserved for those whose departures were most imminent, whose breathing had grown so shallow that each inhalation might be their last, whose eyes had begun to look toward horizons that existed beyond the immediate world of stone and flesh and candlelight. She entered this chamber as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, her bare feet silent against the marble floor that had been worn smooth by centuries of genuflections and prostrations, by the knees of countless priests and monks who had knelt here in preparation for the performance of sacred duties. The 5 beds were arranged in a semicircle beneath the domes, positioned so that each occupant could see the painted image of Christ in majesty that covered the curved ceiling above, his robes flowing in stylized folds that seemed to move in the shifting light, his face serene with the particular peace of one who had conquered death and offered that conquest as a gift to all who would accept it. The first bed held a woman whose age was impossible to determine, for the pestilence had ravaged her features until they bore little resemblance to whatever beauty or plainness she might have possessed in health. Her breathing was so faint that it barely stirred the linen sheet that covered her chest, and her eyes remained closed in what might have been sleep, or might have been the beginning stages of that deeper rest from which no earthly voice could call her back. In the second bed lay a man who had been a scholar before the plague claimed him, his hands still stained with the ink that had been his life's work, his fingers curved as though they still held the quill pen that had shaped thousands of letters on countless pages of parchment and paper. Beside his bed sat a leather satchel containing the manuscript he had been working on when the sickness took him, a treatise on the nature of divine providence that would now remain forever unfinished, its final chapters existing only in the mind that was slowly releasing its hold upon the concerns of this world. The third occupant was a child, a girl whose dark hair had been braided with ribbons that still held traces of their original color, despite the weeks she had spent in this place of healing and dying. She could not have been more than 10 years old, and her small hands lay folded upon the wool blanket with the perfect stillness of one who had already learned lessons about suffering that most adults never fully comprehend. Her breathing tower was rapid and shallow, like the flutter of bird wings against a window pane. The fourth bed contained an elderly woman whose face showed the particular serenity that sometimes comes at the end of a long life lived with purpose and meaning. Her white hair had been arranged carefully by the sisters who tended her, and her hands held a small wooden crucifix that had been worn smooth by decades of prayer and meditation. Her lips moved occasionally in what might have been the recitation of familiar verses, though no sound emerged except the whisper of breath moving in and out of lungs that were growing weary of their essential task. B. In the fifth bed, positioned directly beneath the center of the dome, where the painted figure of Christ looked down with eyes that seemed to hold all the compassion that divine love could contain, lay a young man whose condition had deteriorated rapidly during the morning hours. He had been brought to the monastery only 2 days earlier, carried in the arms of friends who had wept as they placed him upon the bed and arranged his few possessions on the table beside him: a small knife, a leather purse containing a few coins, and a letter written in a woman's hand that spoke of love and longing and the hope for reunion in whatever realm awaited beyond the threshold of mortality. Sister Margarita stood in the doorway of the chamber with her great ledger held against her chest, but when she opened it to prepare for the recordings that would soon be necessary, she discovered that the red ink had been exhausted in the documentation of the morning's departures. The small pot that had contained the crimson fluid now held only dried residue that clung to its sides, like the memory of all the names that had been written in its vital color, all the lives that had been commemorated in its scarlet script. She stood for a moment in contemplation of this development, understanding that the absence of red ink carried within it a significance that went beyond mere practical inconvenience. The color had been chosen deliberately for its resemblance to blood, and therefore to life itself. And now that the supply had been depleted, the final entries in the ledger would need to be made in ordinary black ink that lacked the symbolic power of its crimson predecessor. Yet there was perhaps something appropriate about this change. She reflected as the afternoon light continued its slow journey across the curved interior of the dome above. The red ink had served to mark the transition from life to death, but black ink might serve to mark the transition from this particular chapter of human experience to whatever chapter might follow, when the pestilence had finally run its course, and the world began the long process of rebuilding what had been destroyed. The apothecary woman, Alina, appeared in the chamber carrying the last of her supplies, her leather gloves worn thin from constant use, her face mask showing the stains and where that came from months of service in circumstances that no previous generation had been required to face. She moved from bed to bed with the efficient grace that had become her hallmark, checking pulses and listening to the sound of breathing with the experienced attention of one who could read in these vital signs the story of what was happening within the secret chambers of heart and lung. As she completed her examination of the 5 patients, her eyes met those of Sister Margarita, with the quiet communication that passed between those who had worked together in the presence of death for long, enough to develop an understanding that transcended the need for words. The message was clear. All 5 would complete their journeys before the night was done, and this chamber beneath the dome would soon hold only empty beds and the lingering fragrance of herbs and candlelight and human sorrow. The young monk entered the room with his armload of fresh candles, replacing those that had burned low during the day and arranging new ones so that their light would fall evenly across the beds where the dying lay in various stages of their final preparations. His movements had acquired the meditative quality that comes from performing sacred tasks in sacred spaces, and his face showed the particular gravity of one who understood that he was serving as witness to mysteries that could not be explained but only experienced and remembered. He took his position near the foot of the scholar's bed and began to recite in Latin the prayers for those who were approaching their final hours. His voice soft but clear, each syllable shaped with the precision that comes from long practice and deep reverence for the words that had been spoken over countless deathbeds throughout the centuries. The Latin flowed over the chamber like water over stones, connecting this moment to the vast chain of human experience that stretched back through time to the very beginning of consciousness itself. The 2 other breath-takers appeared in the doorway then, the elder who had served as teacher and guide, and Katerina, who had learned through both success and failure the rhythms and requirements of this most sacred work. They entered the chamber with their velvet cloths and glass vials ready, their breathing already beginning to synchronize with the patterns they encountered in the 5 beds, arranged beneath the painted figure of Christ, who looked down upon them with eyes that seemed to hold infinite patience and compassion. She took her position beside the bed of the young man who lay directly beneath the center of the dome, her gray woolen robe arranging itself around her in careful folds as she settled into the wooden chair that had been placed there for her use. The glass vial that lay upon the table beside her was smaller than usual, no larger than a child's thumb, its surface clear and smooth and perfectly crafted by artisans whose skill had been passed down through generations of glassmakers working the furnaces of Moreno. The young man's breathing was labored but regular, each inhalation accompanied by a soft sound that spoke of lungs that were filling with fluid and growing less efficient with each passing hour. His eyes remained closed, but occasionally his lips would move in what might have been prayer, or might have been the recitation of some half-remembered verse from his childhood, though the words were too soft to be understood by those who watched over him. Through the high windows of the chamber, the afternoon light continued to shift and change as the sun moved toward its setting, creating patterns of gold and shadow that danced across the curved surface of the dome. Above, the painted figure of Christ seemed to move slightly in this changing illumination, his robes flowing in stylized folds that caught and reflected the light, his face showing expressions that seemed to alter with the passage of time and the progression of shadows. The scholar in the second bed began to show signs that his departure was approaching, his ink-stained fingers moving restlessly upon the wool blanket, as though he was still attempting to write the final chapters of the treatise that would now remain forever incomplete. His breathing grew more irregular, each inhalation requiring greater effort, each exhalation carrying with it more of the sound that indicated the approach of the final threshold. The elder breath-taker approached his bedside with her velvet cloth unfolded and ready, her movements showing the confidence that came from months of experience in this sacred work. She positioned herself beside his bed and synchronized her breathing to his, waiting for the moment when his final exhalation would pass into the soft blue fabric and be preserved there as a token of the intellectual life that had been lived with dedication and was ending with dignity. The child in the third bed stirred slightly, her dark eyes opening to focus upon the painted dome above with an intensity that seemed remarkable given her weakened condition. Her small hands moved to touch the ribbons in her braided hair, and her lips curved in what might have been a smile as she gazed upon the figure of Christ, who looked down at her with eyes that seemed to hold all the tenderness that divine love could contain for the youngest and most innocent of his children. The elderly woman in the fourth bed continued her silent prayers, her lips moving in the familiar rhythms of verses she had recited thousands of times throughout her long life, her wooden crucifix held tight in hands that had grown translucent with age and approaching departure. Her breathing was so soft that it barely stirred the linen sheet that covered her chest, and her face showed the peace that comes when earthly struggles give way to acceptance of whatever transformation awaits beyond the horizon of mortal understanding. Caterina took her position beside the first bed, where the nameless woman lay in what might have been sleep, or might have been the beginning stages of that deeper rest from which no earthly voice could call her back. The young breath-taker's movements showed the confidence that had come from her successful completion of her duties earlier in the day, and her breathing synchronized smoothly with the shallow rhythm she found there. The chamber filled with the particular quality of silence that preceded departure, a stillness so complete that even the sound of their own breathing seemed loud in the growing quiet. The candle flames burned steadier in this atmosphere of waiting, their light falling upon faces that had grown solemn with the weight of witness, upon hands that were ready to perform the small rituals that would mark the transition from one state of being to another. The scholar's breathing stopped first, so suddenly that it seemed as though time itself had paused, and the elder breath-taker moved forward with her velvet cloth to capture his final exhalation as it passed from lungs that had served a mind devoted to the pursuit of truth and understanding. The blue fabric stirred slightly with the passage of that last breath, and then it was still, holding within its soft depths the invisible essence of a life that had been spent in the service of knowledge and was ending in the hope of wisdom beyond earthly comprehension. Sister Margarita dipped her quill in the black ink and wrote the scholar's name in script that was as careful and precise as ever, though the ordinary color lacked the symbolic power of the red that had marked all the previous entries. Yet there was something appropriate about this change, she reflected, as though the black ink represented not just the absence of the red, but the transition to a different phase of existence, a movement from the vital to the eternal, from the temporal to that which existed beyond the boundaries of time itself. The woman in the first bed departed next, her breathing simply ceasing without any visible struggle or distress, as though she had made a quiet decision to release her hold upon the concerns of this world and trust herself to whatever mercy awaited beyond the threshold of mortality. Caterina was ready for the moment, her velvet cloth positioned with perfect timing to receive the final breath that carried with it all the mystery of a life, whose story would now be known only to whatever divine consciousness kept record of such things. The child's departure came with a gentleness that seemed to transform the very air of the chamber, her small chest rising once more as though she were drawing breath to speak some final word and then settling into perfect stillness, while her dark eyes remained fixed upon the painted figure above, who seemed to lean forward slightly in the changing light, as though reaching down to receive the spirit of one who had learned in her brief years lessons about courage that many adults never master. She positioned her glass vial above the child's parted lips, and the final breath passed into its crystal depths with a sound like the whisper of wind through summer leaves. The vial seemed to grow warm in her hands as she sealed it with a small cork that had been blessed by the monastery's chaplain, and for a moment the glass appeared to glow with its own inner light, as though it contained not just the child's final exhalation, but some essence of the innocence and faith that had sustained her through her brief journey in this world of suffering and loss. The elderly woman's departure followed soon after, her lips continuing to move in prayer until the very moment when her breathing ceased and her hands relaxed their grip upon the wooden crucifix that had been her companion through decades of devotion and service. Her face retained its expression of serenity even in death, as though the peace she had found in life had simply deepened into something even more profound and lasting. And finally, the young man beneath the center of the dome completed his own journey, his breathing growing shallower and more irregular, until it simply faded away like music that grows softer and softer until it can no longer be heard. She captured his final breath in her velvet cloth, and as she did so, the afternoon light that fell through the high windows seemed to intensify, creating a moment of perfect illumination that filled the chamber with golden radiance that seemed to emanate not just from the sun outside, but from some source that existed beyond the physical world. Sister Margarita completed the final entries in her great ledger, each name written in black ink that dried upon the cream-colored pages, like small monuments to lives that had been lived with purpose and were ending with dignity. The ledger was heavy now with the accumulated stories of all those who had passed through this place of healing and dying. Each entry a recognition of the value that belonged to every human soul, regardless of the circumstances of its departure from this world. Alina began the process of preparing the 5 bodies for burial, her movements efficient but reverent, informed by both practical necessity and the deep respect she had developed for those she had served during their final hours. The chamber grew quiet, except for the soft sounds of her work and the occasional crackle of candle flames that continued to burn with steady light before the painted image of Christ, who looked down upon the scene with eyes that seemed to hold all the compassion that divine love could contain. The bell-ringer boy appeared in the doorway, but when he reached for the rope that would ring the death bell across the water to announce another departure, Sister Margarita raised her hand to stop him. Instead, she indicated that he should ring the bell only once, a single toll that would mark not just the departure of 5 souls, but the conclusion of this particular chapter in the monastery's long history. The single toll of the bell carried across the water with a resonance that seemed deeper and more final than any of the double rings that had marked individual deaths throughout the long months of pestilence. It spoke of endings and beginnings, of the completion of one phase of human experience, and the hope for whatever transformation might come. When the plague had finally run its course, and the world began the long process of renewal and rebuilding, as the sound of the bell faded into the evening air, she remained in the chamber beneath the dome, her hands holding the sealed glass vial that contained the child's final breath, her fingers curved around its warm surface, as though she were cradling something infinitely precious. The 5 empty beds stood in their semicircle beneath the painted figure of Christ, their linen sheets pulled smooth and their pillows arranged with care, ready for whatever service might be required of them in the days ahead. The candles continued to burn with steady flame, their light creating patterns of gold and shadow that moved slowly across the curved interior surface of the dome above. The marble floor was cool beneath her bare feet, worn smooth by centuries of prayer and devotion, marked by the passage of countless souls who had knelt here in preparation for whatever mysteries awaited beyond the threshold of earthly existence. Outside the high windows, the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that would soon deepen into the purple of twilight, and then fade into the star-scattered darkness of night. But within the chamber, time seemed suspended, held in the perfect stillness that follows the completion of sacred work, the quiet that comes when all necessary tasks have been performed, and nothing remains but the patient waiting for whatever dawn might bring to this world, transformed by suffering and loss and the hope for redemption that persists even in the darkest of times. She closed her fingers more tightly around the glass vial, feeling its warmth put against her palm, and breathed slowly in the silence that had settled over the chamber like a benediction. The painted eyes of Christ looked down upon her from the dome above, and in their expression she found not judgment but compassion, not condemnation but understanding, not the promise of easy answers but the assurance that every breath taken and every breath given was known, unvalued by whatever consciousness had created the vast mystery of existence itself. The work was finished now, at least this portion of it, and she sat in the growing twilight beneath the painted dome, while the candles burned their steady vigil and the silence deepened around her like prayer made tangible, like love made manifest in the simple act of bearing witness to the great mystery of departure and the hope for whatever reunion might await beyond the horizon of mortal understanding. The glass vial grew warm in her hands, and stillness remained perfect and complete, holding within it all the breath that had been gathered, and all the breath yet to come, all the endings that led to beginnings, all the departures that were, also arrivals in realms that existed beyond the reach of earthly sorrow and earthly time.